A billionaire saw a poor waitress feeding his disabled son in front of a restaurant. This poor waitress showed compassion and cared for him even when everyone else who saw him either walked away or completely ignored him. What the billionaire did next will shock you, but the revelation that followed is even more shocking. Sit back and watch as I lead you into this twist of fate. Music. In the beautiful city of Victoria Island, there stood a grand restaurant called the Golden Fork. Known for its delicious meals, the restaurant was always packed with politicians, business tycoons, and popular celebrities. However, Sophie, one of its waiters, hardly noticed them. She was more focused on doing her job diligently and getting paid. Sophie came from a very poor home. Her father had passed away in a car accident when she was only 14. But life became hard for her when her mother, who was a nurse, was diagnosed with a failed kidney. Sophie had to quit school to support her mother and Matthew, her younger brother. She needed the money for her mother's dialysis, the house rent, feeding, and her younger brother's school fees. So, she took on jobs wherever she could, sweeping salons, washing dishes, doing laundry, and finally working as a waitress at the Golden Fork every evening. But on this fateful evening, life took a different turn for Sophie. She had just finished her shift at the restaurant after a loud and wild rain had recently stopped. The weather was extremely cold and the ground was wet. It was a busy time of day, so there were a lot of people on the road that led to her house. It was rush hour and everyone was hurrying to get home before the rain started again. She took some food from the restaurant and headed home. But while she was on her way to the bus stop to take a bus home, she saw something strange. Very strange. Under the pale flickering light of a lonely street lamp, she saw a young boy sitting on a wheelchair all by himself. Sophie found it odd, because it was getting late, and it was unusual that the boy was all alone with no one beside him to help him get around like most beggars in Lagos. She moved closer to him, ignoring the crowd walking to and fro. She looked left and right, but it seemed no one cared. Everyone was focused on their own business. Out of concern, Sophie bent in front of the boy. At first, it felt like pity, the kind of feeling you get when you see a lost puppy. But seeing the young boy shivering alone in the rain reminded her of when Matthew, her younger brother, returned home from school in the rain, shivering and hungry because no one offered to drop him home. Sophie wanted to ignore him, but her conscience wouldn't let her. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly like a lullaby, bending down so her eyes were level with his. "What are you doing here all alone? Where are your mom and dad? Are you okay?" she asked, but he didn't answer. His lips moved as if he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he just looked at her without expression. Sophie could see him trembling with cold, and soon she heard his stomach growling with hunger. She removed her coat and placed it over him to keep him warm. Then she sat beside him and brought out the food she had meant to eat for dinner. When she looked at him again, she noticed that his legs were stiff and twisted in an unusual way, and one seemed slightly shorter than the other. That was when she realized he must be disabled. Yet, she didn't care. She scooped a spoonful of rice from her food, blew on it, and slowly began to feed the boy. The boy hesitated for a moment, then opened his mouth slowly. She fed him one spoonful and another the way she used to feed her brother when he was sick, carefully and patiently. While she fed him, she didn't notice the people around her who were staring at her as they walked past, including her co-worker from the restaurant. When Sophie was done feeding the boy, she asked him softly, "What is your name?" The young boy blinked and his lips moved, but just as before, no sound came out. But when Sophie pointed to herself and said, "I am Sophie," very clearly she noticed the boy smile. However, Sophie didn't notice the black Mercedes SUV parked across the street in the shadows with tinted glass. Inside the car, a man dressed in a neat suit watched everything in silence. He watched as every other person ignored the young disabled boy and walked past, and how Sophie stopped just to attend to him. The name of the man was Mr. Richard Grayson, the billionaire real estate mogul who owned half the buildings in the city. And the young disabled boy at the entrance of the grand restaurant was his son. His name was Samson. Mr. Richard's heart moved deeply when he saw Samson smile. In over 2 years, he had not seen his son smile. Doctors had tried. Teachers, too, had tried. He had taken Samson to many beautiful places with bright balloons and toys, but he never smiled. "Take a picture," Mr. Richard told his driver. And a picture capturing Sophie and Samson together was taken. Mr. Richard looked at the phone and nodded his head. Then he made a call to another driver to go and get Samson. Sophie was still trying to communicate with Samson on the wheelchair when a sleek, dark vehicle pulled over in front of them. A man in a stiff uniform stepped out and approached them. The man didn't greet Sophie or even make eye contact. "My boss said I should take him home," the man said. Then he went to grab the wheelchair handle. "Wait, he's cold. You should cover him properly," Sophie tried to tell him. But the man pushed Sophie's hand aside and wheeled the boy toward the car, ignoring her completely. He carried Samson into the back seat, placed the wheelchair in the trunk, and drove off without saying another word. Sophie watched as the driver sped off, and then turned to wait for the next bus at the bus station. But as she walked home, she couldn't stop thinking about Samson, the disabled boy. The next morning, Sophie was on the morning shift at the restaurant. The bus she entered had a fault, and by the time she reached the restaurant, she was a little late. As soon as she entered the restaurant, she met the manager waiting with crossed arms. "Sophie, report to my office now," the manager told her bluntly. There were no greetings and no questions. Sophie was shocked. Her heart jumped. "What? Why?" "Because I'm a few minutes late," Sophie asked as she followed him inside his office. Inside the cramped office, he didn't even ask her to sit. "I got a call this morning," he said with his arms crossed. "Someone saw you yesterday." "Sir?" she asked, confused. "Some people saw you after work yesterday sitting on the roadside with a disabled child in a wheelchair?" The manager explained. Sophie smiled and answered, "Yes, I saw a boy. He was alone. How is that your concern?" He suddenly snapped. "This restaurant serves wealthy clients, Sophie. The kind who don't like seeing their servers cuddling up with every crippled child on the street." Her mouth dropped open. "Are you serious?" He was alone. He couldn't even speak. "Would you rather I just walked away like everyone else?" She asked him in complete shock at how heartless he sounded. "I don't care what you think is noble," he said coldly. "Image matters. Perception matters. This is not a charity organization." Sophie's hands clenched. She could feel rage in her heart. "You're fired," he said without emotion. "Clear out your locker. Don't come back." "So, I'm being punished for being human." Sophie's heart dropped into her stomach. She didn't argue any further. She bowed her head in shame, then turned and walked away. A lot of questions were running through her mind at the same time. How would she afford her brother's school fees? How would she buy food for her family? Next week was her mother's dialysis. How could she raise the money? Why did kindness always come at a cost? What would she tell Mama? Besides the monthly salary Sophie receives, she often received tips from the wealthy customers. But now she had nothing. When Sophie got to the bus stop, she stood alone in silence beneath the shelter, wondering what she would do next. Then a black car suddenly pulled up beside her. The window rolled down. A man in a black suit stepped out holding an envelope. Sophie was too immersed in her thoughts that she didn't notice the man until he stood before her and asked, "Miss Sophie Miller?" Sophie's heart skipped. She looked up at him and answered, "Yes." The man handed her a cream envelope, then returned to the black car and drove off without saying another word. Sophie just sat there. For a long moment, she kept staring at the envelope. Her hands were trembling as she observed it closely. Finally, she peeled back the seal and opened it. Inside the envelope, there were 3 things. The first was a photograph showing Sophie crouching by the roadside the previous night, feeding Samson in a wheelchair. Sophie gasped. She hadn't known anyone was watching her that night. The second was a folded check of 500,000 naira which bore the full name of Sophie Miller. And the third was a letter which was neatly written. "Miss Miller, your compassion did not go unnoticed. If you are willing, there is a child who needs you. A permanent caregiver position awaits you with full accommodation, fair hours, and excellent pay. No interviews necessary. Report to this address tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp. If you choose not to come, no harm will come to you. But if you do, everything in your life might change. Yours faithfully." Beneath the letter, Sophie saw the address in Ikoyi, one of the richest and most secure estates in Lagos. That was the part of Lagos where mansions had swimming pools and breakfast was served on balconies. She stared at the letter, the photo, and the check in her lap. And for the first time in many days, Sophie smiled like someone who had received a